recovery. This webinar is jointly organized by IDEAS and FLACSO. Let me say a few words about IDEAS and FLACSO. International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, is a pluralist network of progressive economists across the world engaged in research, teaching, and the dissemination of critical analysis of economic policy and development. Its members are motivated by the need to strengthen and develop alternatives to the current mainstream economic paradigm as formulated by the neoliberal orthodoxy. The organization is based in the South and led by economists and other social scientists based in several developing countries, but the membership of the network is open to all committed to developing and using alternative heterodox tools of economic analysis appropriate for meeting contemporary development issues. IDEAS has recently employed Charles Abugri from Ghana as its executive director, and he takes over work which has been done by Professor Jayati Ghosh and Professor Cp Chandrasekhar on a voluntary basis for the last 20 years. With this development, IDEAS is seeking to strengthen its work and presence, particularly in Africa and Latin America, and to consolidate the work it has been doing in Asia. FLACSO is the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. It's a regional intergovernmental academic organization created in 1957 by UNESCO and presently headquartered in Costa Rica with campuses across Latin America. Its goal is to promote academic research and development in the region and in the area of the social sciences. IDEAS and FLACSO have recently signed an MOU to work together on research, capacity building, and policy alternatives for a more just world. This joint webinar is a good example of the kind of joint activities we can envisage in the future. And now to the topic. One of the most critical issues facing the world today is post-pandemic recovery. The world is hurting from a pre-COVID economic, social, and political crisis of neoliberalism, massively worsened by the social and economic impacts of COVID-19 and how governments have handled the crisis. Some of the hallmarks of the crisis are the significant contraction in economies, the unsustainable debt burdens that many countries are facing, and a massive crisis of employment, food security, price hikes in essential services and transportation, made worse by an unprecedented and rising inequalities between the rich and poor, whether it be countries or regions or within countries. And this crisis of inequality is reinforcing existing class, gender, race, caste, rural, urban inequalities. The situation we find ourselves in today is also an indictment of the neoliberal economic and social policies that have dominated the world for the last 5 decades and counting. These policies have been all about economic growth, inflation targeting, the privatization of essential services, and the liberalization of labor policies and institutions. And this has proved unequal to the massive task of addressing the fallouts of the pandemic. This situation demands a massive effort from heterodox economists and all other branches of knowledge production to deepen their efforts to chart alternative agendas, to drive economic growth and structural transformation of economies in ways that promote the well-being of the working people of the global South. These are not new conversations, but they've become even more urgent at this time when so many economies are in crisis and so many people are facing existential crisis. Here to contribute to this effort is an interesting panel of leading economists from the global South. And let me introduce them so that we can begin. The first on our list is Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Jomo Kwame was founder chair of IDEAS. He's senior advisor, Kazana Research Institute, fellow Academy of Science, Malaysia, emeritus professor, University of Malaya, and fellow Initiatives for Policy Dialogue in Columbia University. He was UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, Assistant Director General, FAO, and President, Malaysian Social Science Association. Jomo, as we all know, has authored and edited so many books, academic papers, research papers, and media articles, and he continues to educate us on a day-to-day basis about the current crisis. In his presentation, Jomo will consider some of the constraints to speedily containing the pandemic in the global south, as well as how developing countries can try to accelerate economic recovery despite the constraints they face. Our second speaker will be Professor Martin Abeles. Martin is the director of ECLAC's office in Buenos Aires. His main areas of expertise are macroeconomics, international finance, and development economics. And he has studied economics in the University of Buenos Aires and obtained a PhD from the New School, University of New York. He was research fellow at various academic institutions and held different positions at the Ministry of Economy in Argentina. He's currently also the director at the Master's Program in Development Economics at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. His presentation will focus on Latin America, portraying the pre-pandemic economic situation of stagnation and mediocre growth and its roots, and the main policy and political challenges and concerns moving forward in the midst of the current global crisis. Our third speaker is Professor Cp Chandrasekhar, known to all of us as Chandru. He's an economic columnist based in Delhi. He was formerly a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he taught for more than 3 decades. He's also one of the founders of Ideas and has, together with Jayati, run its affairs for the last 2 decades. Chandru's presentation will focus on how post-COVID policies can address the implications of decades of deregulation and financial liberalization that have contributed to fragilities in developing countries burdened with debt and exposed to volatile financial flows. Our fourth panelist is Professor Alicia Puyana. She's an economics professor at FLACSO in Mexico. Her main areas of expertise are macroeconomics, growth economics, oil and natural resources economics, and international regional integration. She studied at Charles University in Prague and did her PhD at Oxford University. She has been visiting fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, London School of Economics, and El Colegio de Mexico, and has taught in Colombian and Mexican universities. She's a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences and the Mexican Academy of Political Economy. And since October 2021, she has been the chair of Ideas. Each of our presenters will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 5-minute summary and reflection on their presentation by Alicia. We'll then put our questions to the panel, and I welcome you to begin to write your questions as they occur to you. And then the panelists will have a chance to respond at the end. So without further ado, I now will call on Jomo to make his presentation for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgie. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today to participate in this panel at a time which is obviously very crucial for us as we try to think of the way forward. I think it's useful for us to important for us to also appreciate Chandrasekhar and others who have been keeping ideas going all this time. Let me go straight to the subject matter of discussion today. One of the big problems, of course, is that we don't really know that the pandemic is over. To speak about post-pandemic recovery assumes that the pandemic is really over. But we know that the pandemic has been declared to be over by political circumstances as much as anything else. This is very clear, for example, in the case of the UK, but it's also true in other parts of the world. Perhaps one could say, rather cynically, that Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky have ended the pandemic for the world. They have certainly taken attention away from the pandemic, which continues to cast its shadow, a long, dark shadow over much of the world. Another important consideration, in my view, is the fact that we have had very tepid growth in the world economy for the last dozen years or so, ever since the 2008 global financial crisis. As soon as there were what were called the green shoots of recovery after the global financial crisis, the crisis was declared to be over. Instead, the Western world particularly switched to more monetary policies, the so-called unconventional monetary policies, which made soft money available at relatively low interest rates. This is something which we will come back to later. I would like to try to emphasize three considerations for us in the minutes to come. These are very, I would say, bitter lessons from the pandemic experience so far for the future. First, I think for us, it is important for us to recognize that collective action internationally is at its lowest point. Multilateralism has been subverted ever since the end of the Cold War by other considerations. NATO defines security for the rest of the world, and we have a huge number of other problems which we need to deal with. We also have a situation where in the first year of the pandemic, many of pandemic issues were defined in terms of the libertarian West versus the totalitarian East. The strong responses in East Asia, which largely avoided, I have to emphasize, largely avoided stay-in-shelter lockdowns, were contrasted with the libertarian West, where things were pretty much left for things to work out as the West sort of searched for what was called herd immunity. The result of all this was to introduce many false debates in terms of how to deal with the pandemic. But I think it did not distract many countries in the developing world. And particularly, I think the governments of South Africa and India need to be commended for proposing what is often called the WTO or TRIPS waiver proposal. The intention, of course, was to try to make available vaccines, tests, and treatments, as well as personal protective equipment available at much lower cost because of the supply bottlenecks which were being faced and which were causing deaths in many parts of the world. The result of this failure of the world, the blockage of the WTO waiver proposal, mainly by Europe, I think is despicable and something we have to learn our lessons from. The late Nelson Mandela played a very important role in fighting for the public health exception, which was finally accepted in 2001 at the Doha World Trade Organization meeting. But now there is an insistence not only on trying to have so-called voluntary negotiations for each of the items for which exemptions are being sought, but also even when there has been a reluctant switch to to compulsory licensing, we see a great deal of resistance to recognize the enormity of the pandemic problem and to act accordingly. This, of course, is causing deaths, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths. Already the death toll is very high, and the infection toll continues to rise. The second issue, I think, which we need to think about very seriously is the fact that most developing countries feel very constrained, the lack of fiscal space which has been felt in developing countries. And they have generally been constrained from undertaking bolder fiscal responses to dealing with, not only to dealing with the pre-pandemic economic stagnation, but especially to try to deal in a more robust fashion with the pandemic. Part of the reason, of course, is that the monetary order at national as well as international levels has basically constrained this. Yet we find that in different parts of the world, there is a great deal of interest in what is sometimes called a modern monetary theory. But basically, the discussion is around increasing central bank financing. And it's important to note that many countries, many developing countries which were otherwise considered rather conservative, have actually undertaken central bank financing of fiscal space. This is true, for example, in Southeast Asia, of neighboring countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines. These are not radical options, but these governments have taken such options. And I think it's very important for others to consider the possibility of doing so, of course, on a very responsible basis. Another issue, which of course is a problem, is the view in the West right now about the supposedly limited impact, not only of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but also the economic sanctions which have been undertaken mainly by Western governments against Russia and increasingly against countries which are seen as friendly to Russia. The latest sanctions, for example, against Chinese officials is a case in point. Now, it's in the US particularly, there is the view that Russia is no more than a gas station for Europe. But in fact, Russia supplies a great number of mainly commodities to the rest of the world, and this is extremely important. So we find, for example, that most of the wheat supplies to countries such as in Asia, especially in South Asia and Western Asia and West Asia, but also in Africa, especially North Africa, rely very, very heavily not only on Russian wheat exports, and Russia is the #1 wheat exporter in the world, but also Ukrainian wheat exports. These are all being affected by the current strife, and it's very important for us to recognize that this view that economic sanctions do not adversely affect other countries, no collateral damage is being inflicted, is a false view. Food as well as fertilizer, especially for Asia and Africa, as I emphasized, supplies have both declined, and there is a significant increase in prices. In fact, if the sanctions continue, it is likely that these prices will be protracted. Price increases will be protracted. This obviously has very important implications for food security, for improved nutrition, particularly in the developing world, and especially in the poorest countries, which unfortunately have been deprived of the opportunities to maintain food security by the trade liberalization which has been going on in recent decades. So I think it's very important for us to keep on insisting that these implications are very, very serious for certain parts of the world. But in general, they are also raising prices for some of these goods and commodities in other parts of the world, including in Latin America. The third and final point which I want to emphasize is regards to the higher prices which have been due to the supply side shocks, to use the economic jargon, which have been inflicted by not only by the pandemic disruptions, but more recently by the war and the economic sanctions which have been imposed. All this basically implies that central banks all over the world are coming under pressure to raise interest rates. And but I think anybody who looks at the logic of that argumentation will certainly have to question it. When the prices have gone up because of supply side disruptions or supply chain disruptions or whatever jargon one prefers, one has to recognize that raising interest rates does not help the problem. It does not free the supply side constraints which have been responsible for raising prices. So it's extremely important, therefore, for developing countries to reject this kind of approach, of a knee-jerk approach, which I would suggest is because of the ghost of the late Milton Friedman, which continues to affect a great deal of thinking about monetary policy at the international level as well as at the national level. Now, supply side increases, of course, for many developing countries, for most developing countries, the pressure for higher interest rates is not, it cannot simply be dealt with simply at the national level. There's a great deal of pressure to raise interest rates, which comes from abroad. And this is hugely problematic as developing countries try to cope with this situation. So where do we find ourselves now? I think basically the developing countries now have to deal with new challenges, not just the challenges posed by the pandemic of relief, of providing relief during the pandemic. And this continues to be a problem because many parts of the world continue to be plagued by the pandemic, but also how do we ensure recovery, but particularly recovery for sustainable development purposes. And more importantly, because of the major disruptions which have taken place, what are the possibilities for reform which we have in the developing world going forward? I think this is the big challenge for all of us. We live in very different circumstances in different parts of the world, but it is very important, in my view, for us to try to focus our efforts on dealing with the questions of relief, recovery, and reform together, because in a sense, this will define much of the shape of the world in the near future. And of course, different societies are under different pressures to deal with these problems in different circumstances. But I think it is important for us to emphasize that there is a great deal, much of what is going on today, for example, in terms of the imposition of sanctions, actually contravenes the United Nations Charter. Much of what is going on in the world today, including the NATO-led actions, contravenes the UN Charter. And it's important for us at this time to find a space to assert the space for multilateralism. And precisely because of that, I'm very happy our second speaker is Martin Abeles from ECLAC in Argentina. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jomo, and for being on time as well. I'll now give the floor to Alicia to make a short reflection on what you just said in Spanish. Thank you. Alicia, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, please, Alicia.
I will talk in Spanish, okay?
Yes, please.
Okay,
that's
muy bien. No es fácil hacer una breve reseña o comentarios de lo que Jomo nos acaba de explicar. Además del llamado al multilateralismo en el marco de los espacios que dan a los países en desarrollo la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, que es un punto de inicio para el análisis de lo que ha hecho. Llama la atención su gran énfasis en considerar tanto la pandemia misma como las políticas que se hicieron, como las medidas que se hicieron y la definición de que ya terminó la pandemia, que es una cuestión política. No ha terminado, no sabemos el alcance ni la profundidad de la pandemia, lo cual hace difícil ver las soluciones, el camino hacia adelante, pero ya debemos empezar a considerarlo. Segundo, a este problema de la pandemia se une la guerra en Ucrania y los efectos de las sanciones impuestas a Rusia, que ha tenido y tiene unos efectos generales en todo el mundo y muy especialmente en países en desarrollo. Rusia no es solamente un exportador de petróleo, no es un petroestado, es una economía compleja en una sociedad compleja que no se puede minimizar. Los efectos en la inflación es un choque de oferta también muy grande que va a generar un choque de demanda por la caída de los ingresos. Entonces, combinada la pandemia, el tratamiento de la pandemia que afectó el multilateralismo, las respuestas fueron vergonzosas, como dice Jomo, porque se estableció, como escribió Yayati alguna vez, un apartheid en vacunas. y en el tratamiento a esto. Y pocos países lograron hacer una vacunación masiva y expansiva porque hubo un tratamiento de la adjudicación de las aprobaciones de las vacunas también muy político. Eso afectó también a los países del sur. Y lo más importante es que ha afectado el espacio fiscal que los países del sur tenían para enfrentar primero la pandemia en un marco en que estaban enfrentando la reconstrucción de las economías después de 4 décadas o 5 décadas del neoliberalismo que solo agravaron los problemas que ya existían. Entonces tenemos el problema de la respuesta a la inflación y la subida de los tasas de intereses, que es una contradicción. No se pueden subir las tasas de los intereses cuando las economías están enfrentando un choque de oferta tan grave como el que encuentran ahora. Eso sería lo que yo entiendo, la síntesis de la propuesta analítica que Jomo nos ha hecho magistralmente. Los países del sur están ahora abocados a una situación muy compleja, con golpes y choques por diferentes aspectos, y es necesario recurrir al multilateralismo y a la acción conjunta de los países en desarrollo, que no obstante las diferencias que pueden tener en varios aspectos, comparten muchísimos puntos y muchísimos espacios señalados muy bien por Jomo. Eso sería todo, creo yo.
Muchísimas gracias, Alicia.
No sé
Thank
si
you.
se honora su presentación. Okay.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Now we will move on to Martin. Martin, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dzodzi, for chairing and organizing this webinar. I am honored to share this panel with Jomo and Chandru, two good old friends. So I'm so glad and proud to be here with you. I will focus, as Dzodzi anticipated, on Latin America, and then try to make a more general point, very much in line with Jomo's conclusions, I believe. The usual disclaimer applies even if I'm a member of ECLAC in the UN. The things I'll be saying right now are my personal opinions alone, even if I'm using a lot of the information that ECLAC itself produces. As many of you probably know, Latin America experienced one of the highest, if not the highest, relative death toll during the pandemic. Holding 8% of the world population, it suffered more than 30% of total deaths. And of course, as in other developing regions, it took a terrible economic hit, falling almost 7% on average, with, of course, a disproportionate burden on women and other parts of the population. But as someone said already in the chat here, that is the case in Latin America. Latin America was not doing well before the pandemic. And I would like to stop there and talk a bit about the pre-pandemic situation in Latin America before discussing post-pandemic recovery proper. And I will concentrate on South American countries, which, as you know, are primary exporting countries, which are also deeply integrated to international financial markets. Since I need to be concise, I will portray South America's situation prior to the pandemic by posting 6 stylized facts. So let me go through them succinctly. Stylized fact 1, a consistent deceleration of economic growth from, say, 2014 till the outbreak of COVID-19, from close to 5% to less than 1%, with a meager 1.3% prospect for 2020 before the pandemic hit the region. This low growth cum deceleration was not just due to the fact that some economies in particular, as Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, were doing pretty badly, but even excluding these countries, the deceleration is important. I don't want to baffle you with numbers, but this low or medical growth in these countries was low also compared with other developing regions in the global south. In the period 2014 to 2019, before the pandemic, South American countries, excluding Venezuela, grew only 1.9% on average, compared to 3.3% in Sub-Saharan Africa and 4.6% in developing Asia. So, stylized fact one, low and decelerating growth during the 6 years prior to the pandemic. Stylized fact two, an across-the-board fall in investment rates, 2 or 3 percentage points in terms of GDP, depending on the country, but this was across the board as well. Stylized fact three, a widening productivity gaps vis-a-vis advanced countries in most sectors in South America. Stylized fact four, a very significant deceleration of exports measured in real terms when compared to the good old years prior to the international financial crisis of 2008. Exports growth fell from almost 7% in that period to only 1.5% in the 6 years prior to the pandemic. This fall was even more pronounced than the fall in international trade, of which we all are acquainted with, which means that there was some structural shift there, which I don't want to get too technical, but could be portrayed as a fall in the export elasticity of the countries in the region, which, as you know, can pose severe problems in terms of balance of payment crisis, etc. Stylized fact five, growth or important growth in foreign indebtedness, in foreign debt in all regions, both private and publicly held, from close to 30%, circa 2013, to more than 50% prior to the pandemic. And stylized fact six, a pretty spread conservative or procyclical fiscal policy stances in almost all countries, with a probably exception of Chile. Of course, these six stylized facts are interrelated, and I think this is very important before we move on. It shouldn't come as a surprise that investment is shrinking if economic growth is decelerating. It shouldn't come as a surprise that productivity gaps are widening if investment is going down. It shouldn't come as a surprise that exports decelerate if productivity gaps are widening. It shouldn't come as a surprise that countries depend more and more intensely on foreign borrowing if exports are not growing fast enough. And it shouldn't come as a surprise either that fiscal policies are conservative or procyclical if countries are increasingly depending on foreign finance. And finally, and this brings us back to square one, it shouldn't come as a surprise that growth is decelerating if we're pursuing conservative or procyclical fiscal policies. So I think, as someone said here in the chat, that before speaking of recovery, we should not assume, at least in Latin America, that we were growing beforehand. And the way we interpret this situation is very important for how do we tackle the agenda moving forward. I would argue that the situation I just portrayed resembles what classical development economists used to call a low-level equilibrium trap. And currently, some analysts call this middle-income trap, or refer to these situations like middle-income traps. I would rather refer to this as a quote-unquote neoliberal policy framework low-growth trap, or something like that. Because it is difficult to imagine a different outcome in countries which are primary exporters with weak or non-existent industrial policies, which are deeply integrated financially to the rest of the world. And this is why I believe, at least in the case of Latin America, that we should not be talking about post-pandemic recovery. Of course, we have to discuss whether the pandemic is over or not, as Jomo has just suggested, and I do agree with that. But even if it were over, we shouldn't be talking about recovery, but rather about reconstruction, redesign, or as Jomo himself put somewhere else, like building back better or building back different. there's no way we want to go back to that situation of relative stagnation. I think I have a few more minutes, so let me move a little bit closer to the present. Most countries in Latin America recovered well in 2021 from a minus 6.8% fall in 2020. We are expecting a recovery of close to 6.2% in 2021. Almost all figures are out there already. But growth, and we know growth is not development, but let me just stick to that variable. Growth is expected to come back again down to close to 2% during the current year. And countries face now much tighter situations or much tighter constraints, as Jomo suggested, than they did prior to the pandemic. Higher external debt, a higher interest receipts, and a higher proportion of their public debt, especially denominated in variable interest rates. And this, of course, is a matter of macroeconomic and financial concern, given the acceleration of inflation in the global north and the already ongoing tightening of monetary policies in the US and elsewhere. In this context, of course, as you may figure, fiscal consolidation, what one would call, as Jomo also suggested, premature fiscal consolidation, is regaining or gaining ground in policy circles, in coming down in this hemisphere from what someone before called or dubbed the Wall Street Treasury complex, and the room to maneuver recovery or a reconstruction is not so clear moving forward. So what is to be done? And let me close here, at least for now. I think we know, most of us here, what we'd like to push for at the international level. Say, regular SDR issuances, the establishment of an international sovereign debt workout mechanism, debt suspension initiatives that are more comprehensive than the ones we've experienced recently, some kind of regulation or dealing with credit rating agencies, etc., etc., etc. The question to me is, and I think this connects with Jomo's conclusions, what type of social coalitions, both nationally and regionally, and for what type of national development strategies should we be pushing for, should we be thinking about in the meantime? And by in the meantime, I mean, while we try to put the genius back into the bottle, by which I mean putting hyperglobalization or financialized hyperglobalization back into the bottle. So we have, I think, progressives, heterodox economists have a clear agenda of how to fix some things at the international level. And of course, this might take years or decades to come about. But I think we are not so much, or we don't have so much clarity as to how to work within our national and regional economies in this so restricting context. So I would like to leave it there. Thank you again, Dzodzi, for sharing this. And I'm open to questions, comments, and whatever as we move on this morning here, this evening there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martin, for reminding us that the world was in crisis before the pandemic, and that crisis did compound how we experienced the pandemic. I'd ask Alicia to spend 5 minutes reflecting on the points that you just made.
Okay,
Thanks,
con mucho gusto. Otra presentación muy clara y muy iluminadora que tiene, perdón, varios puntos de coincidencia con la presentación de Jomo. Yo quisiera aquí, respecto a la conferencia de Martín, recalcar, sin presentar las cifras que él presentó, la situación compleja que tenían los países latinoamericanos durante las últimas décadas, desde que se inició las reformas estructurales, el ajuste estructural que tiene que ver luego con el ajuste fiscal que se está proponiendo bajo el nombre, digamos eufemístico, de la consolidación fiscal. Detrás de la consolidación fiscal, lo que se hace realmente es un ajuste del gasto público para no hacer otra cosa que se debe hacer en Latinoamérica. Y yo aquí expando un poco las ideas de Martín. Yo creo que el ajuste fiscal reemplaza una real política fiscal más progresiva, la evasión fiscal y también en algunos países la fuga de capitales nacionales hacia el extranjero, que pone a las economías latinoamericanas en una constante crisis de balanza de pagos. Esa es una de las características y Martín lo señaló muy bien. La crisis de la pandemia nos encontró en una situación crítica económica, casi que podríamos decir, sí, ya. Hello.
Alicia.
Entonces, dígame. Yes, Dzodzi.
I couldn't hear you. I think it could be my internet, so please continue.
Okay. Ahora, ha puesto muy gráficamente Martín la trampa que se dice, la trampa del el equilibrio económico con poca productividad, poco ingreso y una dinámica económica baja. Entonces tenemos un equilibrio fiscal al cual se ha sometido América Latina desde las reformas de una que no se podemos llamar trampa porque es el resultado lógico de la liberalización y la apertura indiscriminada, inclusive anterior de la balanza de pagos y la liberalización del movimiento de capital antes que una consolidación de la cuenta comercial. Eso sería, yo creo que, y es también el llamado a unir fuerzas, analizar conjuntamente cuáles son las respuestas viables en esta situación de ajuste fiscal y en esta situación que estás de crisis y de constreñimientos externos que limitan los espacios de acción de las economías nacionales. En América Latina tenemos un espacio nacional de la economía, del manejo de las políticas económicas muy limitado por las restricciones políticas internas y externas. Martín mencionó que si se excluye a Venezuela y se excluye a Cuba, quizá la tasa de crecimiento de América Latina sería un poquito mayor, pero han sido dos países limitados en sus márgenes políticos por acción política externa de los Estados Unidos, que también ha limitado a otros países, Argentina también, algunas veces a Colombia, Bolivia, etc. Entonces, no podemos, creo yo, obviar ese aspecto político de las políticas nacionales de los países en desarrollo. Está siempre presente y Jomo lo marcó muy bien. Eso sería todo, Dzodzi.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for that reflection. I now would like to call on Chandru to make his presentation.
Thank you, Dzodzi. And I must say it's a privilege to be here with this panel of distinguished economists, of course, also friends, and with this audience committed to pursuing ideas which allow for more orthodox approaches to policy in the developing world. What I'd like to start with is to say that in one sense, if we ask ourselves the question in the long run, what are we trying to think of in a world in which once the pandemic wanes and we put it behind us and we are on to a trajectory of stable growth, we do know that what we need to achieve is in many ways been sort of listed, categorized, analyzed, understood by by economists in developing countries, by the international community. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have all of the ambitious targets which have been set on the climate front, or the climate and environment front, etc. So we do know where we want to get, and we know that the issue there is that there are two things among many which are quite crucial to realize that. The first, of course, is the need for large volumes of finance, the trillions of dollars which people speak of over the years. And the second, of course, is that these are areas in which expenditures would have to occur in activities in which the likelihood of significant private returns would be low, whereas the externalities are such that the social returns and the social benefits you can get are huge. So you basically need significant expenditures, but expenditures channeled through means and mechanisms which allows you to transform the structure, to design the program, to allocate resources to areas in which the benefits are social in substantial measure, even though it need not be that the profits are missing completely. Now, if that is the long run sort of ambition which the world is, or the international community in many cases has claimed it's committed to, the problem we are facing today is that that we need to get up to even begin to walk that journey. And by what I mean by begin to get up is one, of course, is that it's necessary for countries to pull themselves out of the sort of depths of the Great Recession, which the world was pushed into post the global financial crisis. And you not merely need that kind of a recovery to get yourself out, but you actually need to do it in a way in which you're on a stable trajectory in which the structural reform can be undertaken, assuming that you have governments with the intention and the social sanction to do so in order to be able to get to these social goals. And the importance of those social goals, of course, were underlined by the experience with the pandemic, long years of neglect of health, for example, deprivation which many developing countries are characterized by, basically meant that the vulnerability of these systems to a shock of that kind was far, far greater than would needed to have been the case if you had actually had a different set of policies pursued in the past. Now, the thing is, even as far as sort of getting up to begin this journey, to pull ourselves out of the trough, which was sort of beginning, but really hadn't gone far enough. We hadn't done it prior to the pandemic in full, and the pandemic, of course, made things much more difficult. And now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine and the fallout of that. That what you needed, it was clear, is that to be able to achieve that, governments must have been in a position to be able to undertake large expenditures, because you needed those large expenditures in order to inject the demand, to pull these economies out of the trough into which they descended. And once the pandemic struck, you needed that expenditure not merely to deal with the medical emergency which the pandemic implied, or the health emergency that the pandemic implied, but you needed it also in order to deal with the supply and demand shocks which were associated with the pandemic. Now, if you look at it, as was pointed out by my co-panelists, we know that neoliberalism, I mean, starting with the Greenspan years virtually across the globe, neoliberalism meant that there was a shift to fiscal conservatism and an increasing reliance on monetary levers for macroeconomic management. And that this, of course, affected developing countries more because of the fact that developing countries were under significant pressure, either from the international financial institutions, like the IMF, into programs of which many of them were tied, or were under pressure by global financial capital, which was always footloose and threatened to leave if you didn't adopt a policy which they considered to be appropriate. And an essential element of that policy was fiscal conservatism. So the point is, if you look to the period of the pandemic, people began to say that, oh, things are changing, that there is actually a shift which is occurring, that now there is a greater willingness to actually, sort of use the fiscal lever, and number of conservative economists, including institutions like the IMF, were encouraging countries the developed countries at least, to move away from an excessive reliance on unconventional monetary policies to actually utilizing or relying more on proactive fiscal measures. But this did not apply to the developing countries. In fact, the developing countries, we found, if they were tied into programs associated with the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, were still subject to measures which actually imposed austerity on them. And there are other developing countries, both the so-called emerging markets as well as the so-called frontier markets, which were the poorer ones, poorer countries, where to the extent that they had legacy foreign capital within their jurisdictions, within their borders, were under pressure from international finance not to adopt this. So even if we go by the IMF's figures, if we take the year 2020, for example, we find that something like little more than 90% of the accumulation of debt, both public debt and the private debt of the non-financial sector, was actually on account of the advanced economies in China. Only 7% of the increment in debt, which occurred in that 1 year, which was the year in which the pandemic struck and you needed to actually exercise the fiscal lever, that only 7% really came from the rest of the world, leaving out the advanced economies in China. Now, this obviously meant that that the structure, I mean, the fact that the structure of this international system is deeply inequalizing comes out even more when you're in the midst of a crisis. And obviously, that's widened the sharp divide, which in any case existed over this period. It widened during the period of the Great Recession. It widened even more during the period of the pandemic. So the first lesson I think we should take is that so long as you remain integrated in excess measure, either because of the fact that you're relying on bilateral or multilateral flows of capital from the development aid network, or if you're reliant on, as many countries became, including relatively poorer countries in Asia and Africa, on flows of private capital into bond markets, if not equity markets, but in some cases, both bond and equity markets, then the possibility of you being able to even exercise that minimal amount of autonomy needed to just get up and begin walking when you're in the midst of the crisis becomes difficult. And this, of course, becomes even more difficult once we go to the medium term and say that you not merely want to try and get yourself out of this trough, you need to actually have some degree of stable growth occurring in order to be able to make the structural changes, in order to do those things which will allow you to meet the SDGs or move towards them, to try and get closer to your climate goals, particularly in tropical countries, which get affected or expected to get affected quite significantly. Then obviously what you're basically saying is that you need to create for yourself. The first thing is to try and carve for yourself some degree of policy autonomy. And that would require that you would have to go through a period in which you try to create the space in which you would be able, by exercising your right to tax not merely through progressive income taxation, but through inheritance taxes, through ST and through wealth taxes, utilize the fact that there exists a huge amount of potential surplus which lies embedded in many of these economies because of the extreme inequality which characterizes them, to mobilize those resources in order to be able to undertake the expenditures which you need in order to be able, as I said, to get up and start walking, which you cannot do if you remain integrated in one way or the other in excess measure with the international system. Now, once you move beyond that, I think begin to think of what kind of a post-Great Recession, post-COVID world that we would like, in terms of one which is more egalitarian, more people-centered, which actually takes into account the need to address the worst forms of social and economic deprivation. Then obviously what we have is a situation in which any degree of openness beyond a certain minimal measure creates the following kinds of difficulty. And that difficulty really lies in the fact that if you look at what is happening in the current context, post the Great Recession and post-COVID, because of the fact that this excessive reliance on monetary measures, which Jomo referred to, for example, had resulted in a situation where this huge amount of cheap liquidity, initially because of the fact that the great moderation, which resulted partly from the relocation of manufacturing capacity to the low-wage regions of the world, which therefore kept inflation of goods and services under relative control. And the fact that for a long period of time, the international system, because of the lower growth associated with the neoliberal era, could keep commodity prices down, including the prices of oil, resulted in a situation where inflation, in terms of inflation, the prices of goods and services was not seen as too much of a problem. And therefore, you ended up with a situation where central banks increasingly were not anymore worried about inflation targeting as they were earlier obsessed with, but really were concerned with actually putting liquidity into the system in order to be able to support the financial system. Ever since Greenspan made that statement in 1987, that was an important component. And this has resulted in a situation where you have had not merely a high asset market price inflation in the developed countries, but you saw this huge carry trade where this cheap money was borrowed and taken into developing countries, such that there is this large volumes of legacy capital which exists in many of these, many developing countries. And as I said, not merely the so-called emerging markets, like say India or Brazil, or Thailand, but also many of the frontier markets, where bond markets have actually become things which you target because of the fact that you're looking for new areas into where you can pump this cheap liquidity. Now, if you have that legacy capital and you try to make this transition to doing the kinds of things which you need, both in terms of stimulating expenditures which take you in the direction of where you want to go, and making the structural changes needed to ensure that money would flow into areas where the social benefits are large, but the private profits may not be great, could actually trigger a situation in which you would see some degree of exit of this large amount of financial capital, which is the legacy capital which is accumulated over these years when the developed countries accumulated this capital because of the huge infusion of cheap liquidity into the system by the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and so on. Now, in addition, because of the fact that as you continue to do this, at one point of time, we now return to a world where inflation is once again a threat. The great moderation seems to have been put behind. And therefore, these countries want to unwind those policies. And when they unwind those policies and interest rate goes up there, in any case, there would be a tendency for capital to move out. Now, this would obviously mean that the sort of policy space needed to do the kind of things would become difficult to carve out, because of the fact that every time you try and do something, you'll accelerate the exit of capital, and that could actually trigger significant currency depreciation, a financial crisis, bankruptcy of firms which are exposed to international debt, which now in local currency terms would be much more expensive. And you could have actually debt deflation leading up to a recession and a depression in all of these economies. Now, this essentially means, I think, that there would be a period in the transition in this journey when governments would have to accept a certain amount of pain in order to be able to carve out the policy space they need. And I think we need to face up to this, because not facing up to this has essentially meant that in many countries where left of center or even progressive governments come to power, they come to power with promises, but once they are in power, they cannot do what they want to do, because of the fact that they haven't actually got the strength, perhaps the social sanction, to be able to actually allow that period of pain when you move into a situation when you can carve out for yourself the policy space to do the things which you need to do to get up, to start walking, and then proceed on this journey which would get us to where we want to go. So I do think that really, in some sense, you're saying that we need to have a developing world, given this intensification of the Great Divide. We need to have a developing world which is able to insulate itself to a certain extent to create the policy space. But the transition is going to be a painful transition. So it also requires a situation in which there exist governments with not merely the will, but also the substantial social sanction to be able to say that we need to cross this by making these sacrifices in the short run in order to be able to put ourselves into a situation where we can just get ourselves out of this trough and then get on to stable growth such that we can reshape the system to get to where we want to do in terms of the kind of world that you'd like to shape. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chandru, for drawing attention to the challenging situation we face and also the challenges with this fiscal space that you are recommending that we fight for. And I like that whilst we're talking about economic matters, I think you've raised in a very stark manner, the question of politics. Where do governments actually get the social license with which to begin to do what you're saying is a very painful set of reforms that are needed in order to create the space for us to begin to tackle in fundamental ways the problems that we have. I'd like to ask Alicia to reflect on your presentation for 5 minutes.
Gracias, Dzodzi. No es fácil hacer el resumen y la interpretación de la excelente presentación de Chandra, pero brillantemente él ha unido y ha comentado o ha unido la presentación de Jomo y la de Martin para resolver algunos problemas. Propone como condición, y como Dzodzi remarcó, propone para unir las muchas metas ambiciosas que tenemos en los varios programas y los pactos multilaterales universales y una mayor crecimiento e independencia de los países. Ese periodo, ese paso de estas propuestas a la realidad es un periodo de transición que Chandra ha sugerido sea un delinking, un poco aislarse del mundo, especialmente de los nexos financieros que han creado, a ese sí, una trampa financiera que llevan necesariamente al aumento de la deuda. Entonces, propone un periodo de transición que tendrá dolor. Yo creo que si se llega lógicamente a superar la trampa del bajo equilibrio, la trampa de estar encerrados en el equilibrio de bajo consumo, baja productividad, bajo ingreso, el dolor se puede compensar. Ya llevamos cinco décadas de dolor sin ningún beneficio. La gente ya lo ha experimentado. No solamente los más pobres, también la clase media, especialmente en América Latina. Entonces, ¿qué nos propone Chandra? Quizá un atemperamiento del multilateralismo. El multilateralismo sí, pero en el marco de ese aislamiento de los países en desarrollo de la égida financiera. Nos presenta que el 93% de la deuda pública y privada es de Estados Unidos y China. El 3% solamente de la gran cantidad de países del sur que no puede salir de la trampa de la deuda. Para ello, para salir de esa trampa de la deuda y del bajo crecimiento, Chandra propone, en primer lugar, ampliar el espacio, hacer las reformas estructurales y movilizar una gran cantidad de recursos propios internos que están ocultos. Se sabe que están. Uno son poner impuestos, gravar la gran riqueza. Y ya hay muchos estudios y mucha justificación ética, filosófica, moral y económica que se deben gravar las grandes riquezas. Entonces, tener una fiscalidad mucho más severa, evitar al máximo la fuga de capitales, amasar esos recursos, legacy capital, ha mencionado Chandra, que va a crear un espacio monetario. Para crear ese espacio monetario, financiar las reformas estructurales, el cambio estructural, que yo me imagino es generar una producción que no se centre como se ha centrado hasta ahora en las actividades más intensivas en capital y más intensivas en tecnología internacional y capital internacional, que ha sido desde la sustitución de importaciones el marco de la industrialización, al menos en América Latina. Ese creo yo que es mi interpretación, es un cambio estructural que va a afectar no solamente la política fiscal, la política monetaria, pero también la política productiva, para subsanar así finalmente los problemas que se agravaron con la pandemia, que ya existían, y los problemas derivados también de la guerra y la política financiera, la política internacional. Todo esto ligado, lógicamente, al Fondo Monetario Internacional y demás agencias multilaterales de desarrollo. Esa sería mi propuesta interpretativa de la gran presentación de Chandra.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for that reflection on Chandru's presentation. I think it's time now to hear what comments we've received about while the presentations were going on. I would ask our panelists to look in the chat. There are comments from Ama Yumnam, Garans Apham, Barry Herman, and Krishna Kumar. And I would like to request that they reflect on those comments. If you haven't seen the comments and you'd like them read out, please let me know. Have you seen those? Have you seen the comments in the chat? You have, okay. So in that case, I'd like to ask Jomo to speak to two comments that I saw in the chat that related directly to what he has said about recovery.
Thank you very much, Dzodzi. Allow me to respond to Garans Apham and as well as to Krishna Kumar. The situation, excuse me, the situation in the world today, as I see it, is so much more difficult for civil society to put pressure on the powers to do the necessary reforms. We all know, for example, that even before the pandemic, things were not going well as far as let us say, the Sustainable Development Goals are concerned. But I do not see a strong commitment, particularly by the rich countries, to trying to achieve those goals. It has been very disappointing, for example, to see that in the year 2015, at the time when the Sustainable Development Goals were being adopted, just months before that in Addis Ababa, at the Financing for Development Conference, the rich countries basically blocked two very major developing country initiatives. Number one, to enhance international tax cooperation in order to try to achieve, to strengthen domestic resource mobilization in developing countries. And the other was any attempt to try to address international financial system reform and international monetary reform, which Chandru has very eloquently discussed. So I am not optimistic about the likelihood of this. I do agree that the current managing director of the IMF is perhaps more sympathetic than her predecessors as far as addressing some of the concerns of the lowest income countries. But beyond that, I do not see, and she has already been basically served notice that her time is up, that she will not get another term, and so on and so forth. She has run afoul by people who are very influential in the Treasury Department, which is next to the White House. So I'm not hoping for much help from there. There have been very important proposals, for example, to try to increase, and this is Barry Herman's suggestion, to make available Barry Herman's proposal is to make available the G7 the excess SDRs which the G7 countries have from the last issue. Certainly at least 6 of those 7 countries have a lot to spare, but there is no inclination of any willingness of the G7 to try to move in that direction. Now, on the positive side, I think it was quite significant that in last year, this U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen agreed to endorse the idea of the International Commission on Tax Cooperation, etc., which Jayati Ghosh was a member of, to try to introduce standard minimum corporate income tax across the world, the proposal from the Commission was 25%. She made a more modest proposal of 21%, and of course, Mr. Boris Johnson reduced it even further to an almost meaningless 15%. Nonetheless, it represents a very important breakthrough in international cooperation on taxation. And that is something, one of the few things I would say to be welcome. As far as the SDRs are concerned, although these mechanisms for transferring SDRs to any of the 15, I think, designated international financial institutions have already been agreed to a long time ago, there does not seem to have been any significant effort to transfer such resources, even to the African Development Bank or to the Inter-American Development Bank, and it is very unlikely that there will be any such initiative as far as the Asian Development Bank is concerned, let alone the Development Bank of the South, which is not so designated, and neither is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The third comment, the other proposal, as far as the SDRs are concerned, which Barry does not mention, but which I think is important for us to consider, is the whole question of trying to ensure that there will be far more, that there will be regular SDR issuance. And this is a very important proposal, I think, but there does not seem to be all that much appetite, and simply issuing SDRs without a significant redistribution of that kind of international finance does not seem to have much support internationally. Now, the other point, if I may, Georgie, the comment by Krishna Kumar was, what are the likely effects on East Asia? I think we have to recognize that even before Ukraine, there has been, in the last decade or so, a concerted effort to lay economic siege on China. And this has been going on. The pivot to Asia under President Obama was enhanced by President Trump, and there's no indication that President Biden is going to step back from that. And as I mentioned earlier, that there has been recent sanctions introduced against certain Chinese officials. Now, earlier, when the Prime Minister Abe was Prime Minister, and he was a long-serving Japanese Prime Minister for almost 5 years, he joined President Trump in asking Japanese firms to withdraw from China. Now, the reason why it is important to mention this is that most East Asian countries especially in Southeast Asia, but also in the rest of East Asia, are actually quite deeply integrated with the Chinese economy. And once you lay siege on China, you also undermine prospects for the rest of East Asia, especially Southeast Asia. The last point to be made in this connection is that undoubtedly the producers of those supplies which are going to be disrupted might benefit. Some of the producers might benefit from the higher prices and so on. This is undeniable. But for every country which benefits from, say, higher fuel prices, there are so many more countries which will suffer from those higher fuel prices. Likewise, with food prices, we have already seen, even before the pandemic, that the number of FAO recognized food insecure people in the world was actually going up. So you have a curious situation where poverty is supposedly coming down, but food insecurity was actually going up. If we consider as well the significance of diet-related non-communicable diseases, the situation is far, far worse as far as NCDs as well as micronutrient deficiencies are concerned, especially in the developing world and especially for women and children. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I'd ask Martin to speak now to any of the questions. And there have been additional questions since Jomo started speaking. So if there are any more you wish to take up.
A few reactions, both to questions and co-panelists. First, I'd just like to mention, as Jomo suggested, that there was, during the pandemic, more policy space, more fiscal policy space, and the possibility of monetary financing fiscal policy than was previously acknowledged by typical financial press, by orthodox policy circles. So I think that what Jomo just pointed out is very important. Sometimes constraints are ideological, not just financial, when it comes to pursuing more proactive counter-cyclical policies. So that's one first point. I think it is very important. Many countries discovered this during the pandemic. Second point, following up on Chandru, capital account liberalization, financial integration, not only reduces macro policy space as traditionally seen, monetary policy, fiscal policy-wise, but it also reduces the margin to maneuver in terms of, say, progressive tax policies or even industrial and technological policies. So if you have an open capital account, if you have a vulnerable financial situation, you don't have to introduce a progressive income tax in order to get capital flight. It is enough that you start talking about it and you will get capital flight and you'll get, so to speak, disciplined about it. So it is a big, how to design and improve and enhance our policy spaces moving forward is a first order condition in order to, for everything else that's being discussed here. Reacting to some of the questions in the chat, of course, agree with Barry Herman's proposal, and hi Barry, haven't seen you in a while. From ECLAC, we've been proposing something similar even before the war, during the pandemic, the possibility of recycling excessive SDRs from G7 countries and the similar, but not only for low-income countries, but also to middle-income countries, where the bulk of the world's poor population actually lives. But we should insist on that type of proposals, and it is, to be sure, not politically, but technically a low-hanging fruit in the international discussion. Regarding the possible effects of the war and rising commodity prices in Latin America, one would have to see the structural situation of each country regarding oil production, food production, mineral production, whether the remittances are important, and so on and so forth. Before looking at each situation in particular, I would guess that if high international commodity prices remain in place for some time, this may benefit some of the Latin American countries from the point of view of their current account, if you're an oil exporter, if you're a food exporter, et cetera, et cetera. But to the extent that this pushes or keeps pushing inflation in advanced countries and monetary policies keep tightening in advanced countries, it will harm them at the capital and finance account side. So whether one beats the other is going to be a matter of case-by-case study. But I'm a bit pessimistic as to the possibility that the positive, quote unquote positive, because this will benefit only a few sectors in this economy, will outweigh the negative impact of, say, a reversal of capital flows from the region to a more secure financial places if monetary conditions keep tightening in the global north. And finally, someone asked something about vaccines in Latin America. Vaccination policies were very heterogeneous. We have countries with domestic capabilities and capacities to produce vaccines, and we have which have been able to cover close to 90% of the populations, with other countries which have not reached yet a single-digit coverage in vaccination. So, indeed, inequalities, as mentioned by Jomo mainly, but also by Chandru, in terms of healthcare and coverage regarding vaccination, it is very much was very present. Inequality was very pervasive across the region in this sense. I think I can leave it there. If I missed a question, I pick it up later.
Yes, and actually, before I ask Chandru to speak, I'd like to acknowledge comments from Prachi Bansal, Jay Shankar, Amit Sadukan, Krishna Kumar again, and Amma Yumnam again, and Barry Herman, continuing the conversations that they began with their initial commentary and questions. If we are not able to answer all of these questions because of the lack of time, please be assured that we will keep them in view. It will be part of the record of this conversation, and it will go into future conversations. So thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I'll now call on Chandru to make his comments, and then we will close this meeting.
Oh, very quickly then, the first point I want to make is that while it is true that we need to make demands of the advanced nations, we meaning developing countries, particularly given commitments they must meet since they had a role in the inequalities which they developed over a period of time. Experience has once again shown over the last few years that they themselves, independent of the rhetoric of the MDGs, the rhetoric of the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, etc., that in practice that they don't deliver at all. In fact, sometimes even scuttle what is possible. I mean, Jomo spoke about the global minimum corporate tax. We know that it's not merely, being brought down in terms of the tax rate, but this will apply only to a bunch of the really big companies, to profits about 10%, and at this low rate. So much so that countries which, for example, had imposed a digital services tax on the big, the platform players, the Googles and the Facebooks, etc., and now have to withdraw that as part of this international agreement, are going to get less revenue. Or do you take the 100 billion which was promised as per year, which is deeply inadequate in terms of the kind of climate finance they should provide, given the fact that they have been the major emitters. They've occupied the carbon budget in huge measure. The 100 billion has not got realized, which should have got realized in 2020. So so even the SDRs, the SDRs issues. Finally, what are you going to do? You're going to hand over a bunch of SDRs to the IMF, to the RST, whatever it is. It's going to go with all sorts of implicit and explicit conditionalities. So I do think that, that while the pressure on the developed countries, to the extent that we can get unity among the developing countries, should continue, that cannot be the basis of policy. That must be something which you can look to give yourself a degree of flexibility, but the policy itself must be something which is developed by the developing countries themselves, which they can then own in a real sense. The second thing, there was a question about whether we're going to have the possibility of another bubble. I think what has now become clear is that if you have a huge liquidity overhang, which comes as a result of policies which try to generate bubbles of the kind which gave you the growth you got between 2003 and 2007, before the global financial crisis, that even a minor disruption can result in significant inflation because of the existence of that. People talk about supply chains being affected, but things have now being redressed over a period of time. And yet, what are we talking about? We're talking about 8%, or more inflation in the United States, something which you haven't seen since in the 70s and the 80s. So once you have this kind of a liquidity overhang, it's become clear that even a small disruption can result in a situation where you get what you thought you had overcome, which is inflation, that you had the great moderation. And therefore, the pressure from finance not to go back to that beyond a point, excepting to the extent that it suits them, is going to be high. And finally, it is true. I'm not trying to say that there is there is no. I'm not trying to say that the spending which occurred in the developed countries was something which suited the poor in the developing countries or went into social expenditures, etc. It of course went to support capital in multiple ways. But we must accept the fact that you had deficits in the range of 20% of GDP in the United States, and you had double-digit deficits in many European countries. Independent of where it went, you did see a willingness to retreat from the fiscal conservatism which you had for a period of time, but that was acceptable only in the developed countries. It was not something which was acceptable for the developing countries. So all of this, I think, points to the need for recognition that, in some sense, we can't expect it to come from the developed to the developing. That you really need to carve out your policy space yourself. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Chandru. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. And this is frustrating because I think our conversation got even more interesting with the comments and the counter comments. It's been a very informative and interesting 1.5 hours. And I first want to thank Vikas, Anil Kumar, Charles Abugre, and all those who made this this webinar possible for organizing it. I also want to thank profoundly our speakers for the ways in which they have brought new insights into this search for the way forward for developing countries. We have deepened our understanding of the war in Ukraine and its implications, far-reaching implications for food security and prices in developing countries. We have deepened our understanding of the constraints in the global economic and financial architecture, and also have discussed some of the solutions needed to change that. We have stressed the need for national level policy autonomy and also fiscal autonomy, and how that could open up spaces to develop alternative policies for real recovery, reconstruction, whatever you call it, development. And I think the conversation has just begun for us in Ideas and FLACSO. This is just one of a range of conversations that we hope to have this year and the next. So we hope that you will come back and join us. I particularly want to thank our participants for their engaging commentary and the need to continue to participate in our activities. I hope you will come back and continue to engage in these discussions, and also begin to serve as panelists yourself for future engagements. So I would basically like to declare this meeting closed and say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of us wherever we are. And let's meet again. Let's come back next time. We advertise more conversations so we can continue this important task.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Chair.